Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I am reviewing this APOC Survival Longsword. Now, right up front, I did not buy this sword. It was sent to me by the sword store, Sword back when they were promoting the fact that they had opened a store, and they asked me if I wanted to kind of do a video about their store and receive a review sample or two. And this was one of the ones that I did. I selected with that process. This sword sells for $150 to $200, somewhere around there, depending on where you look. I'm going to split that difference and call it $175. If you want to buy it from Swordist, I believe they have it listed at $166, and then you can get a 5% off if you're a new customer with their a coupon code. It's kind of available in a lot of places though, because the distributor of APOC is Kaz Iberia, the parent company of Hanway and Dragon King and Kingston Arms and APOC. So one of the biggest sword distributors in the world, really, and therefore a lot of people carry their swords. So if you do want to get one of these, shop around, you'll find a good price. Oftentimes these are on sale as well, especially at the Sword Buyer's Guide store. I have noticed APOC swords have a sale there quite often. Not right now, at least not at the time of recording, but pretty often. So you can probably find this sword for less than $150 if you're diligent about looking for those sales. So a couple things to talk about the design of this sword and the thought behind it. This was designed by Angus Trim. And if you know swords, that's a very big name to know. And he did a good amount of design work for APOC. They have a wide range of this type of sword, but make sure you pay attention to the listing because Angus Trim did not design every single thing in their lineup. So if you want an Angus Trim design at a budget price, these are not a bad idea. But make sure you look to see if the specific model you're looking at was designed by Angus Trim. So this is obviously in the tactical, modern style of sword. And oftentimes those swords are just overweight, overbuilt, and don't really handle that good. So that's why it's really cool that these are designed by Angus Trim, because he is so focused on handling and cutting performance and, again, handling. So you get swords that handle well in a tactical look at a very affordable price. At around $175, it is not easy to find a good quality European inspired sword. So these are definitely attractive, especially if you like that tactical look and that's what you're going for. Personally, that is not my thing, but I wanted to get this because I wanted to see what is possible in this space. All right, this sword does come with a scabbard here, and I use the term scabbard rather loosely because there's nothing traditional about this at all, but it is made of a hard core and then has some finish to it, and it seems to be practical for long-term storage. So scabbard does work. It has this interesting finish to it that really reminds me of some katana scabbards, some saya. It's got a speckled and textured surface that is very reminiscent of, I think it's called ishime finish on saya. Just kind of an interesting thing. The other thing is that the shape, while it's straight, the shape of it is kind of similar to a saya as well. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to see. Now, if we take it out, this piece up here, I believe, is plastic. These mounting holes are designed to be compatible with a MOLLE system. I have no experience with that. I have no idea if it actually works. And then the core here is made of fiberglass. So if I look down the throat here, I see a lot of glue down there. Not something I would prefer to see, but it doesn't seem to have impacted the sword at all. There is a hole at the bottom of the side, the scabbard here, that presumably is for drainage. You know, in a survival situation, you may not be able to keep your sword perfectly dry, and the idea is you can drain the water out. I haven't tested that. If I look into the hole, I see something near it. So I don't know for sure that it actually is open to the rest of the scabbard, but that's what it is. What it is, you know. Now the other interesting thing about the scabbard is that it doesn't fit by, or it doesn't have retention by tension, whereas normally, you know, the scabbard fits to the sword by either tensioning right up here at the throat or by having just a smooth fit here. You can see or hear maybe there's not a whole lot of rattle. There is a little bit of a rustling sound, not rattle. So it's a pretty decent fit, and I have to give it a bit of a tug to get out. That is because there are, on the sword itself, there's a divot in the handle right there on both sides. That divot fits into a protrusion on the scabbard that is how it maintains the fit. So when you put the sword in the scabbard, when it gets up there, you have to give it a little bit more of a push, and then those protrusions, those buttons, whatever you want to call them, fit into the divots in the handle, securing this pretty decently into the scabbard. As for the hilt on this sword, there's honestly not a ton to talk about. It's a pretty simple hilt, all full tang. The guard here, if you even want to call it a guard, is integral. And then there's not a pommel, there's just this glass breaker sticking out the back that has a hole for if you want to do a wrist strap or a lanyard or something. The scales on the grip are a fiberglass composite, I believe it's G10, and they are affixed to the tang with these hex nuts, which means you can disassemble this and reassemble it, which you would want in a survival apocalypse setting. You'd want to be able to disassemble it for maintenance if need be, or if you needed to replace the scales with maybe some piece of wood or something, it's nice that you can easily disassemble it and reassemble it. Like I said, the guard here is barely even a guard. Sure, you could theoretically block strikes, like if a sword's sliding down, it could theoretically block that, but it pretty much offers very little protection. You can see my hand almost goes beyond it as is. What it's best for is stopping the hand from sliding up the sword and grabbing the blade, especially on thrusts. The G10 is generally pretty comfortable. The edges are smoothed over pretty nicely. And one thing that's really nice to see is that the tang doesn't hang over the scales at all. So there's no sharp edges from the tang to bite into the hands. That's an advantage of using something like G10, which is a stable material, so it's not going to shrink and cause that to happen, which can very often happen with wood scales or even bone or antler. They can very often shrink. So I find this grip, generally speaking, to be effective. I like the shape here in some ways. The swell back here doesn't really stop the hand from sliding, but the swell does just enough to discourage the hand from sliding off. It actually reminds me a little bit of a katana shape with a bit of a Rico shape to it, with a bit wider here, a little bit of narrow, and then swell out there. Now, I find it effective. I can lock it in my hand and have no issues with it like twisting in my hand. But I did find with a little bit harder use that it did tear up my hand, particularly my offhand a little bit. I'm not sure what did it, but you can see here it tore off the skin a little bit. It wasn't the tang. I'm not sure what did that, but it definitely did tear my skin and hurt, although gloves would have repaired that, or gloves would have prevented that entirely. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this sword definitely features distal taper that is emblematic of what Angus Trim does. The first thing that catches my eye, at least, is the black coloring on here. I don't know exactly how that's done. My hunch is some kind of powder coating, something like that, but it's generally seemed reasonably durable, but not crazy durable. There are some scratches in that finish after my use of it, which I'll get into what I did with it in a little bit. The overall profile is very similar to a Type 12A sword blade, with some profile taper, but not a lot. A tip that rounds into not a fully spatulated, but an acute spatulated kind of, if you will, a relatively long fuller. It's an interesting design, and with that black coating, whatever you want to call it, it is designed to be able to not need as much maintenance to keep it in pristine condition, or not even pristine condition, in working condition. You know, if you're taking this into an apocalypse, you're not going to be able to baby a sword and keep it really nicely oiled and all that. So that's like the idea behind the blackening, I imagine, other than, of course, looking like a tactical modern weapon. Now, it is important to note that the edges are not blackened because they have to be sharpened, and when you sharpen it, you grind away the blackening on it. So you do still definitely need to oil the edges. Now, speaking of the edges, it is mostly one smooth bevel from the center of the blade to the edge, but then where there is actual sharpening, you can see there's an attempt at apple seeding here, but it's not a very good attempt. Hopefully you can see on this close-up I took, where you can actually see multiple angles of where they did the different passes of the grinding. So it's not blended particularly well, and that is going to affect cutting performance. And continuing in that not particularly well-crafted theme is the fuller. It runs down the center of the blade, but it starts and terminates very, very sloppily, and the edges waver around a lot. At this price point, you do have to accept less perfection, but this is far beyond less than perfect. This is, to my eye, a rather sloppy job on the fullering, and I know the people behind Hanwei and all the other brands I mentioned earlier are capable of doing a better job than this on the fuller, even at this price point. This was just not a particularly good example of grinding in the fuller. And continuing with that some more, if we look down the lengths of the blade, you can see a lot of rippling. Most of it is fine. It's just some surface rippling. But there are 3 spots out towards the tip that are much deeper ripples. 2 of them are still relatively small and not particularly bothersome. But there is one in particular, a little past the fuller, that is a deep, I wouldn't even really call it a ripple at this point. It's a divot in the blade where it looks like when they were grinding it, they held it against the grinder at that spot for too long, and it actually divots. The blackening here really shows it off easily. I can feel it very easily, even with that divot and the fact that it's a little deeper than I would like to see. I don't think it's affecting the durability of the sword or the functionality. I've done bending of the sword. I've kind of tried to see if it'll take a set there. It hasn't done anything like that. So it doesn't seem like it's an actual weak spot, but it is definitely a sloppy job of grinding and really could have been done better. All right, let's test the edges on some paper. Now, it's important to say that I have 2 different edges here because one edge I did a little bit harder tasks on. I'll get into that more during the cutting. That's the edge I'm going to start with. That's the edge that is probably at this point going to be duller because of those harder impacts. So it started the cut there and then kind of tore its way through. It did some cutting there, but not a lot. So it's starting the cut pretty easily, which is honestly surprising me. But once it starts the cut, it really doesn't cut through very far before it starts tearing and basically stopping cutting at all. Let's try the other edge now. So this edge is the one that I've done the backyard cutting with, and none of the harder targets. So there, it kind of struggled to bite in up here, and then once it got down into the sweeter spot, it started cutting okay. So yeah, it is cutting in there. It's not a particularly smooth cut. It's more tearing the paper than it is slicing it, but it is definitely cutting and is sharp enough for backyard cutting. So let's talk about cutting. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, I did more cutting and more testing and pushing of this sword than I normally do. But let's start with my normal backyard targets of water bottles. As you saw from the paper cutting, the sword is definitely sharp enough for backyard cutting. And it cuts okay. It's not great in my hands. I think part of that is I am working on improving my technique and really trying to work on getting the hips engaged. And because I'm doing that, I'm kind of relearning, reteaching myself what I'm doing. So my form is suffering as I'm learning that. That's definitely part of why it didn't cut particularly well. It's not that it cut poorly, but it didn't give me very much in the way of clean cuts. And I think a lot of that is my technique. Part of it also, though, is while the sword is sharp enough, it's not sharp enough to do me any favors. You know, it's sharp enough to do backyard cutting, but the kind of unrefined edge and certainly not unpolished edge is not going to give you that really clean snick right through water bottles that a really highly polished and refined edge will do. This will certainly take apart water bottles and let you have fun doing it, but it's not going to give me a bunch of silent cuts. So let's move on past that kind of cutting and talk about some of the more rigorous testing. That's probably not even the right word, but the harder testing I did. First off, let me talk about why I did that, because it's not my thing. I really don't do any kind of durability tests or pushing the swords pretty much at all. But this is a tactical survival sword. It's built into the concept of this sword that you can take it into the apocalypse and survive with it. Use it as a tool, use it as a weapon, bash some zombie heads, chop down some wood, make a fire, make firewood with it, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of implied by the survival in the name. So I wanted to test the edge retention some and the edge durability, and also just how it felt chopping into wood. So the first tougher target I took this sword to was some rolled up and soaked cardboard. This was an experiment for me, whether or not this could work as a decent cutting target. This sword pretty much failed to cut those targets. It doesn't really have the sharpness to do a good job on them. There's some interesting things about this experiment that I did that I'm going to be doing another video about that later. One thing that's important to note about cutting into cardboard is that it has microsilicates in it, I believe that's the right term, that can scratch a blade, can actually chip edges, that kind of thing. That's one of the reasons I tested this sword against it. I wanted to see how it would stand up to cardboard like that. And I can say that I don't see any damage on the sword edge at all. And like I said earlier, all of the hard testing was with one edge, not the edge I did the backyard cutting with. So it was able to survive unscathed from the cardboard, although it didn't really cut into the cardboard, so kind of an inconclusive result there. Now against wood, I have this big tree in my front yard that I need to trim. So I was like, well, let's take this sword and just start whacking it against some of the branches. Now I was not going anywhere near full force here. I was not trying to go full force. For one thing, I'm going above my head. that gets tiring very, very quickly. If I'm going full force, I'm going to wipe myself out very quickly. But I don't need to go full force to test the edge, test how the sword handles, how it feels impacting a harder target, how it transfers shock, how the edge maintains sharpness against the wood. So it worked. I was able to chop into the wood a decent amount. I didn't even manage to get all the way through the limb. I didn't need to. I was just trying mostly to see, a good number of strikes on wood, and that was good enough for my opinion. So how did it do impacting wood? I'd say fine. The edge held up beautifully. I don't see any kind of damage, warping, glinting, anything like that. There's no bend in the blade. And you saw when I did the paper cutting, the two edges were pretty similar in sharpness. So it seems to have at least decent edge durability. Now, in terms of how it treated me impacting it in the wood, the handle did bite into my hand some. In my offhand, it tore the skin in one spot, and I'm not sure exactly what part of the grip did that. I think it might have been one of the rivets that pulled the skin and ended up tearing it. I'm not really sure, but it did definitely bite into my hand and cause some injury to me. If I had worn gloves, would have been no problem at all. In addition, there were definitely some unpleasant hand shocks coming from it, especially on my offhand. With this long of a hilt, the sword vibrates more and more as you get closer down towards the pommel. And for whatever reason, whether it's the G10, whether it's the full tang, I don't know the exact reason, I felt like it was transferring more of that shock into my hand and into my arm than I am used to when I have a bad cut and I impact wood. But all in all, it seemed decent enough at chopping into wood. Now, this is not the tool I would choose for that. I would much rather go for a hand axe, but if this is what you have, it works. All right, handling. So this sword weighs in at 3 pounds, 3 ounces. It is balanced, that looks like about 2.5 to 3 inches from the quote-unquote guard, and is overall a pretty stiff blade. Not crazy stiff, but certainly stiffer than a lot of swords that you will see that are of lenticular cross-section. Oftentimes those swords like that end up being pretty flexible. And this has some flex to it, but not a lot, as you can see right there. The percussion note in the blade is right around 2/3 of the way up, right around where the fuller ends. In the hilt, it is more like right here, right at this top hex nut, which means I really do want to grip it where my hand is pretty much butting up against that guard. That's going to transfer the least amount of shock. I found personally when I'm using it, I actually like to grip it a little bit lower than that, just for the way it feels and moves. But unfortunately, that does lead to a tiny bit more hand shock. And I'm sure I could get used to gripping it all the way up there at the very furthest amount. Now, the other thing you can do, because this has a nice thick ricasso and a guard that accommodates it, you can easily wrap a finger around the guard for more point control and it's just a bit more nimble feeling in the hand, and honestly for use one-handed. Even with this long grip, 3 pounds, 3 ounces, this is very usable one-handed. If I swing like that though, just one-handed, this does start feeling uncomfortable on the fingers. This guard could use to be chamfered over a little bit more. A glove would help that, or let's see if I swing two-handed. It's not as bad two-handed because the offhand does help stop the sword a little bit, whereas like this, some of that forward weight is dragging on this finger right in here a little bit. Not saying this is forward weighted really, but the way it maneuvers one-handed, it does, to me, bite into the finger a little bit doing that. So one-handed, I wouldn't really want to wrap my fingers around the guard unless I had a glove on. This sword does generate a decent amount of sword wind, but not a crazy amount. Just enough to give you an idea if your edge alignment is on. Overall, this is an odd feeling sword though, because the hilt bears really no resemblance to most European long swords, with no particular counterweight on the pommel, a very beefy tang that is where most of the weight in the hilt is. It doesn't quite handle the way a longsword normally does. It's not to say it doesn't feel nimble. I can move it around very quickly, very easily, and it moves well. It just has an odd feeling to it. And it's interesting because, Angus Trim designed this sword, and I can see his design in this sword. It's got that blade that is very similar to a Type 12A, with that lenticular cross section along fuller, but also it's got that stiffness in that style of blade that very few 12A style blades have. Something that Gus Trim is kind of a hallmark of his swords, is that they are oftentimes more rigid than a lot of other swords, and also oftentimes lighter and nimbler. And I can feel that when I'm moving this around. I can get that idea, that feel of an Angus Trim sword, even with, like I said, this doesn't have much of a counterweight in the quote-unquote pommel, even though this is the decent chunk of steel. It's certainly not as heavy as a pommel. Well, Gus Trim swords, his pommels are usually quite small, aren't a big counterweight. He does a lot of his balancing in the hilt with a bigger tang, with fine-tuned and refined blade profiles, all that stuff. So I get where this is coming from, but I don't know that I particularly like the way this sword feels. It handles just a little bit, the weight is more evenly distributed through the hilt than I am used to with a longsword, and that just subtly changes the way the sword feels and moves around. It doesn't pivot the same way without that extra weight down here. And just a couple more notes. For my taste, gripping back here, the grip is a little bit too big for my hand. I don't feel like I have a good secure grip back there. I definitely feel better when I keep my hands closer together. Now, I prefer to keep my hands closer together in general, but back here, I definitely noticed the grip getting a little bit too big for my hand. And when I was saying I like to grip in the primary hand a little bit down from the guard, part of that is because if I grip up here, it's getting a little bit smaller up there, and it's getting just a little bit, quote unquote, off for me. It's still manageable, but I do really like one hand right here, the other hand like pretty much right below it. That's just where my hands feel the most comfortable on this sword. And I'm not going to be doing any comparisons to the sword because, frankly, I just don't have any swords that handle comparably to this or even similarly to this. So bottom line, this sword retails for around $160, $175, somewhere around there. Is it worth that price? Well, when you're talking a budget sword in that price range, you have to accept compromises and flaws. And this sword definitely has compromises and flaws. The execution of the grinding on the blade, not particularly great. The hilt, while it is functional and durable, it does bite into the hand a little bit, at least my hand. And the sword doesn't really handle like a long sword, but maybe that's not what you're going for if you want this sword, because this sword is worth it, in my opinion, if you're really into that apocalyptic, tactical, survival style. For me personally, that's not my jam. But if that is, I think this is a good option. You're going to get a sword that handles well, that seems to be relatively durable, and is very, very affordable. So if that's what you're looking for, yeah, I do think this is worth the price. If you want something a bit more representative of a historical longsword, though, I'd move on. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you to Swordis for sending me this sword. Thank you to you for watching this review. Make sure you do all the YouTube things. Hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment. All that stuff really does help the channel continue to grow. Until next time, Alien Dude out.